Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Akar and Koka Reports. I'm delighted to have with us Michelle Lin Nguyen as our guest. And Michelle is a general internist and a research fellow at UCSF. She's actually part of the National Clinician Scholars Program, and she got her MD at Stanford. She did her residency at University of Pittsburgh, and then you got a master's in clinical research. I'm not sure where, but what
At
was that?
UCSF
At UCSF.
recently, yes.
Okay, very good. And I also saw that you have a BA in anthropology, which may be
Hmm.
relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Michelle is the author of a paper that is really great. I really loved it. Published recently in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And the title is From Individualized Interactions to Standardized Schedules, a History of Time Organization in U.S. Outpatient Medicine. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Great having you. You're gonna have to speak a little louder. First of all, I'm deaf,
Okay.
but I think you're okay. It's better now. This is a terrific paper. You trace the story of how doctors organize their time, and I'm gonna ask you to walk us through the paper. But I mean, now whenever I say I go to a party, people find out that I'm a doctor. The first thing that comes out of the mouth, oh, you must be super busy. And I'm not that busy. Whenever I tell people, oh, I'm not that busy, they're like flabbergasted. But it's true that most doctors are super busy, and it seems always chaotic. So always the race after the clock. And was it always like that?
Well, I think that was the question that led me to kind of pursue this project in the first place. I think having started and practice and feeling that chaos and just realizing that there were just so many factors that were keeping me from being able to care for people the way that I wanted to, and time being the main one. And started kind of delving into what's been done in the literature and trying to figure out, okay, what do we know? And realizing that people had been studying this for decades and that nothing really had seemed to change. Like people were doing similar studies over and over again, trying to make change. So I think the short answer to the question is no, we haven't always kind of had the same relationship with time as we have today, for most people. But I do think that it's been longer than maybe people assume. I think yeah.
Right. I was surprised by that. I agree with you. I mean, that comes clear in your paper. But get us started from the beginning. I mean, the beginning is, when doctors used to do primarily house calls.
Yeah. So, well, we start kind of arbitrarily at the end of like the 19th century, and start when doctors were primarily caring for people by visiting their homes. A lot of that was molded by the U.S. being largely rural, and so doctors would travel like pretty long distances to care for people, and do what they could, basically carry what they had to carry and do what they could. And then I think slowly over time, there were a lot of different shifts in the US, including a lot of like urban migration. So people started moving into the cities, people were more concentrated. And along with like other things, like kind of the rise of like science and that type of philosophy and practice, it just became a bit easier for doctors to start thinking about seeing patients in an office rather than in their homes. So yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what, if you want me to go through the whole thing, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's nice because you have, you divide it into little periods. So you have the rural area, and then the areas that you talk about right now, where the telephone comes. Doctors have phones, and of course patients have to have phones too, but the two happen sort of simultaneously, pretty much.
Yeah.
And then the car, and then the office. Um, but I mean, I don't want to interrupt, but this is a point. I mean, you don't talk about it. It's not within the scope of your paper, but um, certainly something happens that is important at that time. Is you have licensing, right? So the medical licenses come about, and you have in a way a relative decrease in the number of physicians. I think medicine was extremely competitive in the 19th century. I mean, you had everybody could be called, could call themselves a doctor, and they used to have a huge oversupply of doctors in the 19th century, and I think in the 1850s, the main impetus for the organization of the AMA was to try to reduce the number of doctors because they were having fist fights, outside of patients' homes, trying to, if there was a sick call, you'd have like 10 doctors showing up trying to get the business and all that. And so you have, with the mantle of, you talk about the mantle of scientific medicine, you have the beginning of licensing, and then it becomes a little bit easier for doctors. There are fewer doctors. The training becomes more rigorous. You need more years to practice, and they can have offices, and they can start to demand, to sort of call the shots.
Yeah, and I think, one of the major pieces that we focus on is just trying to emphasize that the structure of how doctors were seeing patients and how they decided to organize patient care was at that time a decision. So I think one of the main points of what we were trying to get across is, we have these very standard like procedures to schedule patients and to see doctors now, and it feels like a kind of a permanent reality, but in real life, well, in history, it's only been several decades that people have made the decisions of like how they wanted to organize time. And so
why do you think that physicians in the mid-19th century, at a time when they were traveling to patients, families in their home, where they spent, obviously much more time. Why was time not a major concern then? And why is time such a major concern now?
Well, I think, that is like overall a generalization that I think, time could have been a major concern for some doctors, of course, but I think in general, there was likely a big difference in expectations around what like that patient-physician interaction was going to be like. Part of me feels like there's some, like with the advent of the appointment system and things kind of raising an expectation of punctuality and kind of like almost, I don't know, like a routinized like punctuality, that the expectations around that interaction also changed. And so to me, it feels like, there's added pressure on the physician or whoever's working to kind of fit into those expectations. And I guess my personal opinion is now we probably haven't done a great job at it, like kind of establishing realistic expectations for those interactions and how and related to them to how we actually kind of have designed our time organization.
Right. But don't doctors start to make more money in the 20th century than they did in the 19th century?
Definitely.
They start making a lot more money, and one way of making more money is seeing more patients, whereas before it was the ethos was such that doctors were not expected to, they were not poor, but they were not expected to be all that rich, and they were expected to be available and spend more time. Whereas again, with licensing, with the scientific mantle and whatnot, then you have a propping up of the standing of doctors, and an expectation that they should, you talk about it, that they should have an automobile before everybody else. It's actually quite amazing that you say that by 1923 there were nearly 4 million cars in the United States, and almost all physicians owned one. That's pretty staggering. That means that already by 1920, which means barely 10 years after the Flexner reforms and licensing laws were passed, they were already rich enough to most of them being able to afford a car. And then they set up their office. And then there's this brief period before World War II. I think most of the what you talk about and this scheduling system starts at around World War II or shortly thereafter. But there was a period of time in the 1920s which you have the doctor with the office and the medical secretary.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me was probably the golden age. We talk about the golden age being the 1950s and 60s, the golden age of medicine, but I think the golden age was probably in the 1920s and 30s when you had the independent doctor with the medical secretary, who's an integral part of managing the doctor's schedule, right? I mean, that's very interesting and very in a very personal way. Here again, I'll quote from your piece. By the 1920s, a successful practice required someone to fill the position of an office assistant or secretary. She, and in this era, it was almost always a she, took on much of the physical and emotional labor of the doctor's office. She was expected to help the doctor and the patient feel comfortable, fielding telephone calls, tidying the office, brewing the coffee, and perhaps most important, managing the doctor's time. And I think that's, I mean, that I'm sure that's correct, and I'm sure that and I think that was good. To me, it sounds pretty good. No, or is that too?
Well, I mean, I would say.
I mean, take the gender piece out of it. I mean,
Right,
isn't it good
right.
to have to have the doctors have a personal assistant, help them manage their schedule, and that assistant knows the patients and can help decide how much time to allocate for a visit based on
Yeah.
and
I mean, I think to me the fundamental crux of that is like the human relationships involved and just the I don't know. I mean, we can try, I guess, to figure out algorithms to do things like that, but it seems to me like we humans are pretty good at those types of like relationships where you're crafting
we don't look favorably on algorithms on the ECAT and COCA reports.
I could imagine.
We don't want AI and algorithms. Stay out of the office. Right.
But yeah, I mean, every time I think about something like this, I get it, my mind starts going to very complex places. But we hear now talk from doctors about wanting that type of support and support staff, and it's just interesting to me, and I don't really have an answer to this necessarily, but it's interesting to me like how big our clinics have gotten with so many support staff, but then
scribes,
we're still
we have
feeling
scribes, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll talk about it when we'll come back to that when we get to the current situation.
Okay.
But then World War II happens, the shortage of doctors, and then certainly after World War II there's an increase in demand for medicine. There's a big boom, there's funding, the government starts funding, starts subsidizing the insurance industry, if you will, in many ways, or facilitating it. And so you have a big demand for, and that's what is typically called the golden era of medicine, the 1950s, 1960s, when the doctors are really busy and really making good money at that point. And then, Peggy, the secretary at the front desk, that's no longer sufficient. It needs to be more organized. And you talk about two choices that are possible at that point.
Yeah. And that's kind of getting back to these decisions that doctors were making in order to figure out how to best, utilize their time. And I think for a long time, because of the simplicity of it and kind of the lesser need of like logistical complications, the drop-in clinic hours was very popular for a long time. So having just office hours where patients could drop in and be seen basically in the order that they came, or depending on the doctor's choice in terms of triage. And then pretty slowly, or I don't know, over some decades, the appointment system came to be. And it seems almost like silly to be talking about the appointment system and its invention, but at some point that was new. And the way that it was invented for a solo practice was that the medical secretary was taking a lot of the responsibility and making a lot of complex decisions about how to allocate time that balanced both the physician's needs and the patient's needs. So it was almost like in most cases, she was kind of really like creating a very customized like business schedule that would hopefully optimize the patient's health and the physician's business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the appointment system comes about, and that's really essentially a rigid, more or less a more rigid grid with time slots. And then, I mean, it's not necessarily super rigid, but essentially time slots. So you don't just go and say, oh, is the doctor here, and then show up, or even just show up at the doctor's office and then hope to be seen. You call and you ask for a specific appointment at a certain time, and then you're given that appointment, or the patient is given that appointment at a certain time. And
I think that probably it was a little more rigid than the drop-in office hours, but still was based on this kind of ethos of personalized like time allocation.
Mm-hmm.
So you would call in and talk with the secretary, but she would know you and know the physician quite well and the way the physician practiced, and could basically, or was expected to, decide how much time to allocate for a specific visit based on what she knew about clinically what needed to happen, the patient, and the patient's personality, and also the physician and the physician's personality. So it was more rigid in the sense that there was some more structure to it, and I think a lot of doctors were seeking some level of like ability to know what to expect. And
mm-hmm.
Also, I think from a business perspective, they were thinking that way, trying to minimize their idle time. But there was still very much a philosophy of personalized allocation of that time. So there wasn't necessarily standardized time slots like we have today.
Okay. And you mentioned that there was partly driven by the fact that if you simply had a crowded waiting room, that sort of looked bad. I mean, there was a bad reflection on perhaps on the doctor as being disorganized and having, just people waiting.
Yeah. And well, that I feel like any of these little pieces could be, longer stories or even books, but yes, there was a kind of a cultural shift of what that meant. And interestingly, before it was a sign of, a popular doctor, potentially a good doctor. And then for some reason over time, it shifted in meaning to just being a disorganized physician, which I'm sure is a complex kind of, like what goes into that is probably complex, but yeah.
Right. Right. It is a little complex. If you go to Anisha's office, it's total chaos. I mean, it's exactly what you described. And when I was reading this in your, it's like chairs in the hallway, chairs, going down the stairwell, people waiting, but at the same time, it gives I mean, it seems chaotic, but it's also, it gives a sense that Dr. Coca is extremely popular. Whereas you come to my office, the waiting room is completely empty. So, one reaction would be, who is this guy? I mean, nobody wants to see him. He doesn't have any patience. So,
I find it was a great piece. Thanks for writing it. I mean, it's fantastic that there are interesting people writing such interesting things. So thanks again for writing the piece. But well, one of the first things that came to mind on reading it was that it seems like we want to, as physicians, exert more control over our schedule, which is perfectly reasonable. And, not having control over schedule is absolutely what, as you rightly put, undermines the patient-physician relationship, and of course leads to a tremendous amount of burnout if you don't have control over things, correct? But it seems like the market is pushing for something completely completely different, right? The wider, when I say market, it's our patients. Our patients seem to want something that's completely out of step with, us wanting more control over our schedule. So it sets up this interesting dynamic. Like, are we as physicians, are we supposed to be patient first, or are we supposed to teach patients, what their doctors can do, or should do? And you talk about, there's that nice World War II ad, I guess, or public health ad that you put out, right? About, you need to value your physician's time because they're ever busier and busier. And it's like, I guess, should we have public health messaging campaigns that say, your physician's time is more valuable than your time? You need to wait, you need to do this. But that's very much against the ethos of how not only the world is working now, or how medicine is working, right? What we want to do is figure out, well, how do we meet patients where they are? I mean, cardiologists are going to barbershops to try to measure blood pressures and treat them there. So, is it, how do you, I mean, there's a real contradiction there, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I think through is, I think I tend to go back to this concept of expectations, and I don't, and maybe this is an optimistic way of thinking, but I think that most people, whether they're patients or physicians, kind of, if they're given, clear expectations of what to expect and kind of feel a sense that they can rely on that, like rely on what information they're given and have some level of consistency there, that most people tend to be reasonable about, what they ask for and what they expect from any relationship. And to me, I mean, I'm sure different health systems work differently, but I think that generally we've gone to a place where we're trying to promise a lot of things that we can't really follow up on, especially in like the larger health systems, because we're being so kind of customer, quote unquote, focused and trying to give people what we think they want. But I think at the root of it, I think people just want us to be able to keep our word. And so if we keep kind of advertising things that are like completely burning out our workforce and not like setting up kind of realistic expectations for them, then we just set people up for failure and then the relationship for failure. So I don't know, I guess my answer is that I think for sure there's like a culture right now of wanting a lot in little time and kind of that expediency piece. But I still think at the basic root of it all, people do still, like when they experience a relationship that they trust and a relationship that kind of is consistent and is able to give them things like basically follow up on their word, then people recognize the value of that. It's just, we haven't quite set it up for people to be able to experience that and understand the value of it.
Right. Yeah.
But
it's interesting that the larger dynamic and the larger workforce is, while we are moving in a direction to try to take more control of schedules, there are other forces that are kind of working against us, if you will, right? Because we no longer are the only game in town, right? Now we have mid-level providers who are, I mean, not to be pejorative, but NP, nurse practitioners and physician assistants that make up large portions of almost every single every single group that I could think of. And part of that, I mean, what is that? Part of that is driven by the fact that there's this huge need or huge demand for to be seen in a discrete quanta of time. So it's almost like, I think there may be maybe some subset of patients that really want what maybe you and I and Michelle want, which is, longer, deeper, higher quality relationships with patients. But then there seems to be this wide world with lots and lots of people that are, they want to be seen in 24 hours, and they want, a 15-minute visit, and they want to be seen on time or within a, they don't want to wait a certain period of time. And I think that in part relates to this explosion of, the explosion of the NP and PA world, especially in primary care, seems to in large part be driven by the fact that the MD and DO physicians that are out there are unable to provide what these folks are, these folks are providing.
Right. So, I mean, but to complete a little bit what, Michel describes in terms of the history, the 2 decades post World War II, you have the emergence of the appointment system, but that's
right.
It's still, as she was just saying a moment ago, still kind of personal because the
right.
physician has some control, and then it's. But then after in the 70s, you have the beginning of HMO and the trend of consolidation, centralization, and then the doctors joined they. And again, for the most part, for personal financial, to protect their financial standing and income and whatnot, doctors choose to join larger groups and to consolidate, to become parts of multi-specialty groups and whatnot and so forth. And with that, they start losing control of the schedule, and everything starts to become less and less personal. And so you have call centers, and it becomes more and more depersonalized with schemes to try to make it more efficient with the answering, the tree, right? You call and you push, you don't talk to a person anymore and whatnot, and all that stuff. But none of this can replace the personal relationship. So clearly there are larger economic considerations that are shaping what's been going on in the last 30 years, 30, 40 years. And within that, of course, you're right, Anish, there's this trying to appeal to, to supplant the lack of availability of doctors by, hiring mid-level providers and so forth. But there are many different factors. I mean, we at the same time, the system, I mean, it's not, patients don't necessarily want to be seen for an hour all the time. I mean, they're right. I mean, there's a circumstance where you want a 5 minutes phone conversation, and there's a circumstance where you need a half an hour or more or whatnot. And trying to sort that out. I mean, there's no way you can sort it out with algorithms or with protocols or to anticipate it in any kind of way that is that does justice to the actual problem. And but so long as as doctors continue to need, in order to maintain their income, to need to see a whole bunch of patients, or to need to do a lot of tasks that are extraneous to what medicine really is about, and we all recognize this. I mean, right now, I mean, I'm sure there's a whole medical literature on how much stuff we spend on extraneous, non-clinical matters. So all these things that get grafted, and then patients are bombarded with campaigns of disease awareness thing, and they're all I mean, the health anxiety, the anxiety about health is just tremendously has skyrocketed in the last 40 years and 50 years. And people the pandemic is just only a reflection of what's been going on for a long time. That health anxiety is just through the roof right now, and even reasonable patients lose the ability of gauging for themselves what's important, what's not important, what requires more time, what requires less time, and all that. So it's not very pretty what's going on right now. And I don't know, Michel, what we have been talking more than
No, I mean, I like listening as well. I mean, I think everything
you call it
so
misalignment and worsening tensions, right? I mean, that's the penultimate section of your paper. misalignment, and it's correct. I mean, it's totally misaligned. I mean, it's completely distorted.
And I think there's, I think there is a level of insecurity that we've created because we haven't been able to. I feel like we've set up our systems in a misaligned way and kind of set up our, like, quote unquote providers or, clinicians for failure in terms of just being able to meet some very basic expectations around patient care, that now everyone feels like they have to fight and claw for medical care or attention within the system. And so I guess that's what I was thinking about, listening to Anisha's kind of like discussion of, people really wanting like these like access and these visits. And at least in my practice, I've realized that, at least my patients, if they're assured that they're going to see someone like within, at least a week or 2 weeks or something, that suddenly that level of anxiety and insecurity and like kind of like grasping for access calms down. But when they kind of get bumped up against these anonymous call centers and suddenly they're like not sure that they'll be able to see anyone within any sort of reasonable amount of time, then that anxiety level kind of gets amped and amped up. So I think that's one thing I'm thinking about, in terms of just very basic
right
kind of reassurance around those things. And
what about the
delivery services.
electronic communication nowadays? Instead of, I mean, because you don't, patients don't need to necessarily see the doctor or the physician or the provider, and now they're given the, I mean, essentially it's almost universal now. Almost all patients now have the ability to send a message through MyChart or whatever the version of MyChart is. Presumably, but where does that end up? And is that a good solution?
I mean, I think to me it's a similar story of not quite setting up expectations, and I think any technology can be used for any, like, no technology I think is like inherently good or bad, and it I think depends on how we're using it and setting it up. But I think the same goes for that I do feel like we're setting our physicians and clinicians up for failure with those types of things too, without the amount of time to deal with those types of messages.
Right.
So
because what the messages do, I mean, those kinds of messages are even more, it's even easier to sort of have them get triaged by non-physicians, first of all. And again, at times it may be very appropriate, but the question is, how do you distinguish when it's appropriate and not appropriate, and to get them triaged. But again, because you lower the threshold. On the one hand, you lower the threshold at which communications can happen, and then you have sort of an overwhelming number of communications of varied levels of intensity and so forth, all channeled through the same medium. So I don't know. The main thing is, I think right now, I mean, it's nothing new, but most doctors who perhaps were thinking about medicine in terms of having personal relationships find themselves in systems that are completely depersonalized, and that's reflected in the way their schedule is organized, and how little ability they have to change it. But that happens. I mean, again, I said again, I mean, in a way, physicians have participated in this. I mean, they're sort of they're not completely victims they do this because it helps maintain a certain standing for the physician and a certain level of income
Yeah.
and
I
whatnot.
mean,
So I don't see physicians necessarily as driving the change in a more positive way.
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the current situation with, almost all physicians being employed in larger health systems, I think that becomes a big factor in all of this, where, it's probably a different story for someone who owns their own practice. But given that right now most physicians are employees and their schedules are, basically controlled by whoever administratively is in charge there, it kind of comes down to my main compass of everything is, and it does touch a little bit on what Anish was saying about, mid-level providers and nurse practitioners and PAs. Like, there's been a shortage of primary care physicians in the country, and no one really wants to work in primary care because it's not a very inspiring career to pursue as a trainee, for multiple reasons. And so,
and this, I think this is a big reason. I mean, what you describe in this paper is a big reason. I mean, this lack of control over your schedule.
But it's not. But yeah, unless you fix the larger systemic issues, and that the larger systemic reimbursement model, I don't see how you fix it. There are two practices. I know of two practices very, very well in a city, shall we say. One practice has a primary care physician who has complete control over her schedule. So therefore, on some days the schedule starts at 10:30, other days the schedule starts at 7:30. It's all driven to try to optimize, the physician's work-life balance. So in terms of children, when to pick them up, when to drop them, whatever. The amount of time given is up to that physician, right? So the physician has total autonomy in terms of, they can select how many minutes, they can select an hour for each patient, they can select 10 minutes per patient, right? So they can select whether they want to do telemed or how they want to do whatever. So it sounds somewhat of a dream, right? They can select how many days of the week they want to practice during a week, right? The issue with that model, right? Is that reimbursement ends up being tied to the number of patients that you're seeing per week, right? And so you end up with, and then that becomes a frustration that, okay, I'm very busy at work, I'm busy at home, and I've structured the schedule and it's very flexible, but this will only allow, this allows me to see only a certain number of patients per day, which then translates into a certain amount of reimbursement.
Meaning not enough. Then
right.
You're poor.
Yeah. Right. So what it is, but the frustration for this physician would be that, this is how I want to structure my practice, right? I want to see one patient every X number of time. I'm going to see about 15 patients over the course of a day. I'm going to practice 3 days a week. I'm going to structure it so I'm coming in 7:31 some days, 10:30 other days. I'm leaving at 1:00 some days. So a lot of autonomy in the schedule. But of course, that means that limits how many patients you can see, right? As opposed to somebody who's seeing patients from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, right, in 15-minute increments, right? And they have 2 scribes with them. Mm-hmm. I'm describing the other practice I know in the city, and that that person, that individual is seeing 40 or 50 patients per day, 4 to 5 days a week. And on Thursday, it's a late day, so they start at 8 a.m. or something, and they go to 8 p.m. That's like a 12-hour day, right? And that practice is significantly, obviously busier because that's what patients apparently want. And oh, by the way, that reimbursement is also going to be, for the year, going to be, significantly more for that. So you have two very different models, one which is in line with, in today's world is as close as you're going to get to have a physician having almost total control of their schedule. But it doesn't matter. They're still going to be upset. They're still going to be not happy because, you're getting reimbursed $40 for a follow-up visit from Keystone First. So you see 10 or 15 patients a day. And oh, by the way, if you have a very tight schedule and you don't allow, if you have a very, very tight schedule and you have total control of the schedule, which means if a patient's more than 10 minutes late, sorry, I'm not seeing you, right? Or say, you don't take walk-ins, right? Because again, when you start taking walk-ins, that explodes schedules, right? That makes schedules go crazy. But again, patients will complain. They want to see this person. So anyway, my point is that within those two models, even this model, if this is an actual physician practice and model that does exist. I'm not just making it up. Even in this highly flexible model, which would be close to what, is kind of what maybe people think they want, that person in today's system is still going to be very unhappy because that model is going to generate, if you're doing 3 days a week and seeing 15 people a day.
Yeah, but they're unhappy because they're going to make the same amount of money as a teacher.
Yeah, they're going to make about $70,000.
What's wrong with being a doctor and making them, what a teacher makes?
Right. Yeah. So you feel undervalued. It's like, why? I went to medical school. I did all this stuff. I have $250,000 in debt, right? And now I'm making $90,000 a year. But I have the schedule of my dreams.
Right. I guess it's like expectations it's both internal and external expectations. Like, I think it goes back to, I think it just goes back to our own expectations for ourselves and what lifestyle that we expect to be living. So do you think we should be educating ourselves in terms of being like, all right, if we want to, we should not want so much? Or, is that? I'm not really saying anything in terms of what I don't have like a set strong opinion about that.
You're very cautious, Michelle. Very cautious.
I
would say yes.
Like
we're entitled.
Complex.
We're an entitled bunch, and I think
a
lot of people, a lot of doctors don't deserve making how much, the kind of money that they make.
I think that it's probably unrealistic to decide that you want everything to be like ideal, like that you have a perfect, like, super flexible schedule where you only see 2 patients a day, but that you're going to be paid by an employer, a big salary for that. I think there are just some expectations that, on every side that is probably realistic.
Right. Yeah, I wonder, are there other professions where you can have a lot of flexibility and you still do fairly well from a financial remunerative standpoint? Anyway, regardless of that, the question is, why not? I think if you had a different model of reimbursement, though, I think you could, and that's the kind of thing that direct primary care, or even, problem with concierge medicine is, of course, it cuts off access to people. DPC is reasonably nice because even working class folks, lower middle class folks can, or people that are uninsured, people that don't have the money to buy regular insurance, they're able to afford kind of direct primary care at, say $100 a month or something like that, and that can serve as their care package, and you get a pretty comprehensive number of things. And that's actually the model that Michelle has. Dr. Akkad over here has a direct primary care model. The concierge model is, of course, you bill insurance and you collect something on top of that. And usually that's a significant sum. And so it's only available to kind of that elite crust of society. But my point is that this physician who has a lot of flexibility, autonomy, and schedule, she could have, I think, they could have they could kind of have their cake and eat it too. Meaning if you had that model, now all of a sudden, you're not getting reimbursed per episode of care, right? Per visit. I don't know. I said episode of care. you're not getting reimbursed per visit. It's not it's breaking free from this fee-for-service scheduling model, and it's basically allowing a reimbursement on a monthly subscription basis. And now, I mean, the economics work out super well. If you take 1,000 patients, and you're covering, say, 1,000 patients, and you're collecting, well, 1,000 is too much, actually. If you take even 500 patients and they're each paying $1,200 a month, which is probably less than they pay for Comcast.
You mean a year?
Yeah, $1,200 a year. Sorry, $1,200 a year, which is $100 a month, which is less than they pay for Comcast. You see how the economics start working out extremely well, right? 400 patients is $480,000 a year, and that's gross. You have to subtract expenses or whatnot, but again, that is a very, very workable model. So our problem, with our system is not, well, you're right, is the scheduling issue, correct? But it's a scheduling and appointment and lack of control that's nested within the system that does not allow for this type of remuneration, this type of flexibility to exist. Because it's like, basically, the system tells you now you can have flexibility, but you'll just be poor.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been struggling with that for a while because that always comes up, and whether it's the payment model that keeps us from being able to be more flexible or not. I mean, I think that is a big kind of part of why people don't feel like they can change the structure of how time is allocated. On the other hand, the actual reality of like these grid-like 30-minute, like complete, like same time slot structure is a little bit different. It's like kind of subtle, but it's like, in reality, I think that there are a lot of consequences to the misallocation of time that could then lead to different, financial implications that we're not talking about. So like having people just scheduled for these 30-minute slots is not as elegant as like actually scheduling people for, the time needed for whatever they're coming in for. And I don't think there's anything necessarily keeping health systems from trying to allocate time in a less, totally robotic manner or rigid manner. So I think that's what I'm chewing on. I don't really have a solution, but
it's a hard system, because it's hard to figure out. We struggle with that as a practice, and the question is, you then have to have a system where you have to have somebody who's clinically sound enough to know that this person is going to need this and is going to be scheduled for this amount of time, and that's not a small task. That's not a small task. Meaning, you have these discrete places where different people have different skill sets, right? And it's like, I'm like ecstatic that right now I have a nurse on virtual text line and calls. That's fantastic to have, because we didn't have that before. And before, it was like the triage process was, someone who kind of was learning on the go, an MA that becomes like some RN level skill, outpatient RN level skill. But now you have, I'm super ecstatic to have a nurse doing that right now, which is great. But do I necessarily want to take that RN who is doing a bunch of stuff that's clinical in terms of prior auths and making these triage calls and refilling some meds and reviewing charts so that, I don't have to, my partner doesn't have to get involved. So I want to take that and then assign them, because it would have to be them. They would have to get the role of scheduling somebody in 6 months to decide whether in this 6-month visit, because it's heart failure and volume overload, et cetera, that it's going to be a longer visit versus a discrete 15-minute visit, as opposed to right now what happens, which is everyone gets shoved into, the standard is. So the easiest thing to do, again, the easiest thing to do is to standardize and say, right, everyone's 15 minutes, and just kind of hope for the best. Which is what leads to chaos. It's just, I think it's hard. It's very hard to create these systems like that. So, and I think that's why I don't know that you can get, and not to harp on this too much, but I don't know if you can get beyond what we have right now without a different reimbursement model. And that different reimbursement model cannot be the government owning you, because if the government owns you, it's like a big corporation owning you. They treat you the same. They will want you to see a bajillion people for, you know, a bajillion people in discrete 15-minute time slots, right? So, and it's because they have the same, they have the same problem. The problem for large systems is that they have a bunch of people that want to get in to be seen, and they need labor units to see a number, you know, a certain number of people, and in order to be more productive, they want those labor units to see as many people as possible. So the only way to break free of this and to exert control again is for physicians not to be employees, and for physicians to have responsibility for fewer patients, and for those fewer patients to generate more revenue for those doctors, so that they're not, you know, they didn't go through a bajillion years of schooling and have $250,000 of debt to make $90,000 a year. So, you know, how you accomplish that without changing that fundamental reimbursement model and without breaking, we just need a revolution. Michelle, are you in?
Yeah, armed or unarmed?
Armed.
I mean,
forget January 6th.
well, yeah.
It is now October 10th.
Yeah.
We're going to war.
Well, yeah, but now let's you know, back of the envelope calculation. Apparently there are 1 million physicians in the US. Suppose tomorrow those 1 million physicians are, you know, they change their reimbursement model and they go on a, you know, direct pay basis. Do you think a DPC practice is going to be able to, you think it's going to be easy for a DPC practice to make, you know, $500,000 a year when you have a million physicians competing with one another?
Well, yeah, because I think there's a large amount of care. Look, right now we're in a widget system where, you know, everyone that comes in, you need to check to see if they're an SGL2. They've had their starting at 45, had their colonoscopy screening, have had, you know, whatever PSA discussions, you know, depression screening, etc. Right? You know, a physician that knows patients very well, do you need to do a depression screen when they come in on a 6-month basis?
I don't think I've done one in 10 years.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Or, you know, exactly what I mean. So, you know, the depression screen is happening. You know, now we have to have a depression screen because the freaking, you know, patient-physician relationship is so screwed up, right? I mean, can you imagine in the 1800s telling somebody to have, you know, well, you need to do this 12-point depression screen so we can screen for depression. The only reason we have that stuff is because we have a bad care model, right? And then of course there's this kind of this primary care, you know, health systems treat primary care as loss leaders, right? Meaning they're like downstream revenue generators, right? And so they're like, oh, you know, make sure you do the, you know, if you're a murmur, make sure you do the echo. So, and then they have like some 85-year-olds are getting echoes for a murmur that then shows aortic stenosis that 10 years ago was not severe, but now they've changed the definition so it is severe. And now, you know, your friendly structural interventional cardiologist sitting there and ready to put your TAVR in. I mean, there's a lot of care that's being delivered. That is venous. I mean, just today, the, you know, colonoscopies, you know, you know, everyone has to get a colonoscopy starting at 45, you know, in 10 years, it'll be at 40. But, you know, oh, by the way, when you randomize people to offering them colonoscopies or not, and you check mortality in 10 years or whatever it is they did, there's no difference, or the difference is extremely tiny, you know? My point is, you know, and by the way, this is all reflected in the fact that despite the fact that we spend, you know, $1 bajillion on healthcare in the US, it's not like our outcomes are necessarily that much better than, say, the UK or Germany, you know? So yeah, no, we deliver way too much care. And yeah, I am confident and we have too many subspecialists for that reason, right? We have like EP right now, the electrophysiologists that are crying about, you know, AFib ablation cuts. And it's like, you know, there's an EP physician on Twitter today I saw saying something about, oh my God, all this AFib, there's 1 million people that need AFib ablations in the next 5 years. How are we going to do this? We can't have these cuts. It's like, no, 1 million people do not need AFib ablations how did the population did not go extinct without getting AFib ablations for the last 200 years. So there's just a ton of stuff that's being, anyway. Lots of stuff. We're gonna have to bring Michelle back for another.
Well, I mean, all of that talk makes me think of. I mean, honestly, I still think it comes down to some level of misallocation of time.
Yeah.
And like, I'm kind of an advocate for the frontline primary care people who are doing a ton in very small increments, or like small increments of time. And I think that there are a lot of unrecognized consequences to the misallocation of time that we haven't really unearthed, that will matter to systems and payers and all of that. And a lot of it does have to do with like care that maybe doesn't need to happen. That like, if you give someone so little time to think about or deal with their job, then, you know, they don't have time to think.
Yeah. Right.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Well, on that note, Michelle,
thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Is the paper behind paywall, or?
Yeah, right now it's behind paywall.
It is. Okay, I'll still have a link. Most of us, people in our audience have access to. Oh, you have a link that can get behind the paywall. Well, we'll see. But I'll have a link to it on the show notes. Again, it's in the Annals of Internal Medicine, on the History of Medicine, and it's a terrific paper. It's just the kind of paper that it's very good to think about. It puts things in perspective, because the problems are not new. They're not like, it's not Obamacare that created all this. It's been around for a long, long time. So, Michelle, thank you very much.